Welcome to STADIO Speaks, the podcast where we dive into the world of education, sports, and everything in between. I'm your host, Kanyisa. Joining us today is Kelvin Watt, the CEO of SuperSport Schools. Kelvin has a rich background in sports research and statistics, and a passion for school sports that has driven his impressive career in sports production and broadcasting. We'll be exploring his journey, the importance of partnerships, and his vision for the future of school sports. Stay tuned for an insightful and inspiring conversation. So thank you so much for gracing us with your presence. We are so appreciative to have you on our show, and we're going to dive straight into the questions.
Pleasure. Thank you. Great being here, and great sitting down with you and chatting.
Awesome. Okay, so maybe tell us a little bit about how you got started in sports and statistics.
Well, look, my involvement in sport goes back to obviously being a kid. Like I think a lot of South African children, we grow up playing a lot of sport. We have the most extraordinary weather, schools, facilities, and I guess that sporting ethos. So it was always part of my life growing up. Having going to university back in the sort of late 80s and early 90s, I was in Pietermaritzburg at KwaZulu-Natal University, and immediately got quite involved from my first year in the sort of organizational and the management of sports stuff, sort of as a committee member in hockey, and then the chairman of the cricket club and various things like that. So throughout my university career, as well as playing, I was involved in sort of the sort of student management and leadership side of sport, and obviously for those of you who know your history, coming out of 89, 90 with Nelson Mandela being released and sort of my last year or two of university, we spent a lot of time sort of putting together the various factions that existed at the time that were obviously largely race-based in South Africa, and sort of putting university sport back together. So I was very privileged in that respect to be involved with some amazing people. Steve Tshwete, for those of you who don't know, was the first Minister of Sport in South Africa later, but he played a massive role in 89, 90, 91 in university sport and sort of integration of sport at that level, and was very fortunate as a young, I was probably 19, 20 to be involved not only in playing but starting to get involved in that sort of world. So that was really early part, and what happened in the sort of back end of 91 as South Africa was moving back into international sport, and obviously into 92 when we made the first sort of international team. For those of you who might remember, late 91 we had a cricket team that went to India, today the Proteas, they weren't the Proteas then. Back in 92, in February 92, going to Cricket World Cups, I started to work in the sports industry for a company called Mega Pro Marketing. So, through, I guess, a lot of luck, there was certainly as a university student, I was studying towards a BCom and law degree. The sports industry didn't exist, in my world. So, got connected with George Rotenbach and Skulk Berger, who was setting up Mega Pro in those days. And as a 21, 22-year-old, I found myself working in professional sport, not even knowing probably a year before there was no business of sport really in South Africa. It was all very amateur. We weren't part of international sport. It doesn't exist. So my journey really started then, and now, 33 years later, I've been in the sports industry ever since.
And what sports were you involved in university and high school?
So I come from a cricket family largely that was always very involved in cricket, and a lot of my growing. So cricket and hockey were the sports that I played. Great love, athletics, I always participated and loved it. But certainly cricket and hockey have been, I guess, my great passions personally in life. But you start getting very involved because what happened in my university career is, having led the sort of tour, I became the president of the sports union, and so you start getting involved right across the board. Now, a lot of mates playing rugby and water polo, and you start getting involved in all of them at that level. But from a participation perspective, very much sort of longer distance running and hockey and cricket, which today still continue to be my absolute passions in life. The sport things that I care about most is certainly cricket and hockey. So
what are some of the key insights that you've gained from working in sports?
Wow, that's a massive question. Look, I think the first thing, and given the audience that we're talking to, that a lot of your community are studying into various things, I think the one thing that really I'd always like to tell people, and funny, I had a discussion with a youngster yesterday who's looking to leave the degree he's doing at UCT and move into because he wants to be in sport. And I keep saying one thing, never ignore the fact that the sports industry needs hard skills. So, often I advise against people, if you want to be in the sports industry, it doesn't mean you must study sports management, because the sports industry needs lawyers, it needs finance people, it needs all sorts of hard skills as well, and the same thing, it needs production skills, and because the sports industry requires all of these skills. Yes. And often the people that come into the system and do the best are ones with hard skills, you know, and they're able to bring those hard skills into the sports industry. And you asked me earlier about research and data. You know, the one thing, I mean, you know, as the owner of South Africa's biggest sports fan research business, the one thing that can never be ignored is your ability to deal with data, understand, interpret data, and see what it says. So, you know, even those hard skills around, you know, data science and research analysis and all of those things are massively valuable skills in the sports industry. So my first thing, or especially to people studying it, is come into the sports industry with a hard skill. You know, and if you've got a passion for sport and all those things, that's great, but it's not the most important thing. You know, sometimes, to be honest, when I'm interviewing people and I say, you know, you want to come and work to SuperSport Schools or our Nielsen Sport business or our Capitalized Media business, which works in the sort of sales side of the business, and they say, I want to work in sport because I'm so passionate about it. I almost want to end the interview right there, because often those are the people that are going to fail. And one of the reasons they fail, you know, you walk into the sports industry, it's a job. It's not all sitting at matches and cocktail parties with players, you know, that's not the business. And, you know, so, you know, I think the first thing is, yes, passionate and care about it. And you want to do that no matter what you do in life. But I think come into it with a hard skill is almost so much more valuable. And so the fact that, you know, as a student that I studied a Bachelor of Commerce and then was doing a law degree, I didn't actually do any articles, but what I learned there and the skills that it able to bring me in terms of, you know, I mean, I think half my life I'm dealing with contracts, you know, so the fact that I've got contract law and spent time around it and then spent 30 years working around it is hugely important. Similarly, in terms of, you know, sort of data science and the maths and the stats stuff that I did, the ability to be able to look at the numbers that have been generated from the research and interpret them and you know, turn them into insights is massively valuable.
I love that, because, you know, we just come from Craven Week and we were interacting with the students and we asked them, what is it that you want to do? Because obviously we're an education institution. And they're like, no, I just want to play rugby. I'm like, no, but like, if rugby doesn't work out, what do you want to do? No, I just want to play rugby, and that's it. They don't want to study. Like, what do you think the importance of education is? Because people tend to lose focus of the hard skill and just are passionate to want to be the player, like the it person.
Yeah, look, I think career advice for anyone, and whether it's in the sports industry or anything in life, is you've always got to have a plan B. You know, and when I say a plan B, it doesn't mean that you must, you know, you don't commit to something. Commit to being the rugby player, but whilst you're doing it, have a plan B. And you know, I've been through generations of professional rugby players and other people, and I think the one thing that they really consider, and if you look through the evolution, I had a very interesting discussion I was part of. You might be a bit young to remember a guy called Gary Teichman, who was a Springbok rugby captain in the late 90s, and he was later the CEO at the Sharks. Okay. And he was discussing with parents one day, and he said, you know, what young rugby players don't understand is they'll leave school and they might pick up a contract, and it's a couple of $100,000 rand, but they're 18, 19, and their first contract will be like 3 years. And they'll feel very wealthy because they're getting, you know, 15, 20, 25,000 rand a month when their mates are all getting pocket money. So they feel very wealthy. But what do? They, you know, they buy themselves a car and they have expensive mates and girlfriend, all those things. And anyway, 3 years later, they haven't really made money, and what they have made, they've spent. They then get another contract. If they're really good, they're probably going to get a contract that might be 600 to 900,000 rand now, and that, you know, again, for a 21 to 24-year-old feels like a lot of money again. But you know, they're paying tax again. They've probably upgraded their car now. They might be deciding now they're buying a little apartment. All of those things. Life's great. If they really make it, I'm not talking about the superstars, the ones who make it at the top Springbok level, that's a bit different. But generally, guys who are going to then go and play provincial rugby might get a really big contract at 23, 24 that let's say is 1.2 or 1.5 million rand again. Now they really think they've, you know, getting into it, they're just getting into it, but they pick up their first injuries, life's getting hard, you paid 10 years, again, you've bought some more cars, you've maybe bought a house, you've maybe getting married, whatever it might be, life's good, and suddenly what happens at 27, 28, the injuries catch up, the youngsters come through the system. If you don't get that next contract, two things happen. Either your contract goes backwards by 40, 50%, or you lose it completely. And now you're 27, 28 years old. You haven't really saved any money. You're still paying off a car. Chances are you haven't paid off the apartment you're in. And you've got nothing. Like, it feels like for 7, 8 years coming out of school, you're the richest youngster in amongst your mates while they're all studying, getting their first jobs, getting those hard skills behind them. But suddenly you're 27, 28, and now you're starting from scratch again. And the problem is you've got a lifestyle that you can't afford.
Yes.
And this is you can replace this with a cricket, with football, with anything. I mean, the same. But and even then, some of those rugby players might get that second contract, but that takes them to 31, 32. And what do you do?
And then after that, what is it that you do?
32 is a long way from 65, 70, and by then children come and they're expensive, and everything else, life hits you. So, and the problem is you're then starting at the bottom again, So, I think the plan B, and the other bit, John Mitchell, who was a great New Zealand rugby coach, and he coached here in South Africa in the Lions, he always used to talk about that players who are studying are more intelligent players and they're better players. The ones that are really problematic for them are the ones who go to the gym in the morning or train in the afternoon and the rest play video games or sit around. Those players who are studying are more intelligent players. They become better players because they're a lot more, they're just mentally more active, and they just make for better humans and for better team members and for better, participants. So, I think, it's any parent or any kid who's thinking that all you need to do in life is play rugby. Even if you make it right up to the very top of it, you've literally got to be the very best of the very best.
How did you get into your career in production?
Sure. I guess being around the sports industry and various things, I started my own business back in '99 when I was 29 years old, and TV part of the sports industry had always interested me personally. We started to look at various opportunities. I quickly realized that the problem with content is that someone always needed to pay for it, and broadcasters didn't always have the money to pay for it. And the best way to do that was to raise your own funding via sponsors and advertisers, so sort of in the branded content space. So very early on, back in '99, 2000, we started to get into sort of branded content. So finding the money to make a show and then making the shows. And it was just always something, I guess there was a part of me, maybe a sort of hidden creative, because I wasn't particularly creative in my life, and sure, we'd done school plays, whatever it might be, but that had been the closest I'd ever been to that sort of environment. Although I must tell you, back in 1986, I think it was, I was very fortunate. We had a family friend who was then working for what was then Mnet in the old Randburg studios, and I spent a week of work experience at Mnet before there was anything of SuperSport before. I mean, 86, for those of you who might know your TV industry, that year, and this would have been in the May, June, but that year, towards the end of the year, Mnet did its very first rugby production. It did a semi-final of the Currie Cup. So it hadn't actually done a sport production, but they were busy sort of working on that. And I spent a week there, and so I guess in the back of my head, it was always something that interested me. I think it ignited it. And and then in the early 2000s, we started to make a lot of, made a road running show for Comrades Marathon that then became a weekly show on SABC called Seleng, and just got in. That was sort of my first, I guess, weekly show that we were doing, and since then I've done just various shows around that, and just to continue to be involved in it. I'm not particularly on the creative side. I mean, I've always had partners and people who've done those. My side has always been more the how did we finance it, the broadcast, the sponsors, how did we distribute it. That was always the part of the business that I guess that's where I brought my hard skills. The passion on the other side was thinking about what are the sort of shows we'd like to make in life, and having some creative input, but it's it's certainly not what I bring to the party. Mine's more on the sort of how do we finance, how do we distribute, how do we manage, how do we analyze the audiences and target what we're making for the right audience.
Okay. What was it like being the producer for the Dan Nicholl Show?
How did you know I did that?
Research.
We
stalked you.
It was an interesting one. Dan, I got introduced to Dan actually through, I think it was Mark Jury, who's currently the CEO at MultiChoice. They'd been at UCT together many years ago and various things. And Dan had always wanted to make his own TV show and various stuff, and actually hadn't worked out how to get it done. He couldn't get anyone to commission it because, again, he was someone who'd never made TV, so who's going to pay you to make it? So we got together and we had a lunch one day, and he said, look, this is the show I want to do. I don't think there's a show in South Africa where we take 3 people, two sports people, and typically a comedian or an artist or someone not from the sports world. And we just talk far more casually and lightheartedly as opposed to having, you know, serious like discussion. And we both felt that South African TV was really missing that sort of environment where sports people were treated a little bit more about who they were as humans, and you had a bit of fun with them, and which Dan is particularly good at. And along came Suzanne Stevens, who at the time was part of the team that was launching Bright Rock, and they were looking for sort of an iconic media opportunity where they could launch the brand off. And I think what really made the Dan Nicholl Show work from the first was that we had a sponsor who not only was putting up the money for us to make the show, which is obviously important, but they were also a sponsor who was happy for us to play, you know, to really do things that a lot of other people perhaps would have been a bit conservative about. And you know, there were a lot of people, Dan has made fun of a few people in his time, and some haven't always warmed to that. It took us about 5 seasons to get Bucky's Boerter to come on the show, because Dan had upset him at a dinner once, you know. He would make fun of him, and Bucky's didn't think it was very funny. But you know, when Bucky's eventually came on the show, he was actually one of the, you know, best guests. He had a very dry sense of humor, and he's quite sort of, doesn't say too much, but what he did say was really cool and was often very funny. So in the end, it was a wonderful show. But yeah, and that's really the genesis of the Dan Nicholl Show. And obviously working with Dan, there were a few things that were special. One is watching his evolution as someone, you know, doing what that does. It's not an easy thing to do, to have 3 people on the couch and simultaneously have a conversation with all 3 of them and keep them all engaged. But also was to see some of this, you know, South Africa's top sports people and some of the wonderful entertainers and comedians that had often never interacted together, you know, coming alive, and finding out that certain of those entertainers had a sporting background, and sometimes some of the sports stars had a musical or entertaining background as well. And you know, so those sort of things came up. But really, you know, we got to have the most extraordinary guests over, I think it was 16 seasons of the Dan Nicholl Show that we did with Bright Rock and SuperSport. So it was an extraordinary privilege, a wonderful thing to have done. But like in everything in the world of content, it ran its course. It's now running as a podcast with Dan, and it's continuing. It was just an extraordinary time and wonderful opportunity to have worked on and been a part of.
Okay, and then can you discuss the transition from production to a focus on sports broadcasting and management?
I suppose you're talking about my sort of role within the SuperSport Schools environment
schools,
and various things. So yeah, maybe, you know, I think it's probably an interesting one, especially for your ecosystem, to understand the genesis of the SuperSport Schools business. What people know today really came in about 2016-17 through my Nielsen Sport business. At the time, we were doing a lot of research for SuperSport and for South African rugby.
Yes.
There were a lot of questions at the time. You know, TV numbers weren't necessarily growing. In fact, on certain things they were struggling. Stadiums were empty, not empty, but emptier than they'd been, you know, in previous years around Super Rugby and various things like that. So we'd done a lot of research. And the question, I guess, that came from SuperSport and SA Rugby was, is there a decline in interest in rugby? Because obviously they felt, you know, the TV numbers were showing that they weren't growing, and the stadium attendance wasn't looking very good. And we went and did the research in our Nielsen Sport business, which is largely run by my wife on that side of stuff. So she came back, and the research found that actually there was a massive growth in rugby and interest in rugby. And when we spoke to people, they were saying in the last 7 days and the last 30 days they had attended and been at a lot more rugby. But obviously when you looked at the evidence of it, we had to match it. And it was really my wife's insight that said, if you looked at the mix of people, the demographic group that were the one fastest growing in interest in rugby was black women, largely sort of 28 and older. And she very quickly realized, you know, when we're talking to these women about their interest in rugby, what they're talking about is they're interested in their children's rugby. And when they say they've gone to watch rugby, they've gone to watch schools rugby. That's where the growth is. And what that led to was a lot more research. And what we found was exactly that rugby actually by 2015-16, especially through the government schools and the schools specifically in the small towns around South Africa, had become a lot more integrated. There was a lot more people playing. There was a massive interest. And in fact, on any given weekend, there was about 1.5 million people going to watch schools rugby in the country, where professional rugby was maybe 60 or 70,000 people at a venues. And I guess that really started a discussion with SuperSport. Mark Jury, who was then the CEO at SuperSport in that time, had actually worked for us in our Nielsen Sport business as a youngster. He'd come out of UCT and started in our research business. So he had this proper understanding of research and data. And we said to Mark, you know, if you look at this is what's going on in rugby and the health of rugby at a schools level. And that sort of answered the question for South African rugby. And one of the things was, guys, there's a generation of black rugby players that are coming through the system, and we're going to see it in professional rugby. And already by 2019 you can see it, and obviously today you can see a game that's largely had quite a change in the face of what Springbok rugby looks like to what it was looking like 8, 9, 10 years ago. And obviously, you know, having Rassie and see all of that, I mean, it all combined nicely, and that's timing in life. But what that led to is a study into the rest of school sport. And what we found was that in any given weekend, 97 to 98.5% of people in different sports who went to watch sport were watching school sport. So largely, when we talk about South Africans being interested and crazy about watching sport, they really were at school sport, you know, watching their kids, kids watching themselves. We did some further research, and what we found, and maybe some of your younger students, and I think you might have just skipped that generation, but largely the sort of younger group now that are sitting between the ages of 10, 12 and 24, they're far more interested in themselves, and they're far more interested in watching themselves play and their mates play than watching anything else. You know, it's this Instagram, TikTok generation. They want to be part of that. And we realized that you know, broadcasting and filming school sport was a massive opportunity, but it wasn't happening. Technology wasn't really there to do it. It was too expensive to do. And so our initial, you know, I guess by chance, what happens when you're doing something, and I'm sort of telling you something that probably took a year and a half of work and thinking, and we'd come backwards and forwards. We didn't quite know what to do with it. And on a trip to Cape Town, I met some guys who were running a little business called School Sport Live, and they really were an ad agency. They had a massive passion for sport, and then when their staff on weekends would go and film school sport and put it on YouTube, but like a couple of games a month, nothing, you know. And we convinced SuperSport to invest in their business and have a look and see, you know, what does this mean? Where can it go? You know, it was being put on YouTube, and that's what SuperSport did, and that sort of is 2018, 19, and the real genesis of what is today SuperSport Schools came actually at the Rugby World Cup final in 2019. There was a group of us South Africans sitting there quite late, and obviously we'd been celebrating the fact that we'd won in Tokyo. And Imtiaz Patel, you know, just recently stepped down as chairman of MultiChoice, actually said to us, you know, you guys are sitting here, you know, celebrating what's gone on here, but we should really understand that we're up against it here. And the thing that really allows us to be world champions is our school system. And as SuperSport, we're not doing enough here. We need to get involved, and we need to secure the next group of World Cup winners. And you know, he said the same thing about cricket, the same is about hockey, about all of these sports. And in fact, one of the things that's probably the biggest problem with football in South Africa is there's not enough football in our school system that's generating the generations that we had previously. You know, the fact that we could win 96 African Cup of Nations and qualify so well for 98 and 2002 World Cup was a lot of that generation of footballers had grown up in a time when football was a school sport, and we had hundreds of thousands of kids playing in a very organized system of football that generated that system. And that really led to early 2020 saying, okay, we need to get serious about what's now SuperSport Schools and what is going to be the business plan. And our original business plan for SuperSport Schools in 2020 was to make 360 matches, produce 360 matches and put it on YouTube. And for 2021 was to do 480 matches. And we were literally had accepted that business plan and were starting to work out how we would commercialize it when COVID hit. So that pretty much for 2020 shut us down. But what it did do was it gave us the opportunity to really think about what we were going to do. And what also happened in that time is technology fundamentally changed around the world. Streaming platform technology, we realized we didn't have to be a YouTube channel because it's tough to be a business on YouTube. It's a very good if you YouTube. It's not so good if if you're hosting your business on YouTube. You know, the YouTube business model is made for YouTube to make money, not really the rest of us. You know. And there's the odd shining light sort of YouTuber but they're unusual. It's a bit like our rugby discussion. You know, one or two. The rest spend a lot of time making content, don't make any money out of it.
Don't make any money out of it.
Whatever they tell you, they make it. So what that led us to do, and where we got really lucky, is we came across a technology called Pixelot, which was an automated and AI-driven camera. And what we realized by employing those cameras and putting them out at schools, instead of us coming to a school and filming a game and then coming back 6 weeks later and trying to build that community, we could actually be on site week in and week out. And because one thing that we realized in the school and youth sports space was that people aren't interested in schoolboy rugby, they're interested in a particular school, or they're not interested in schoolgirl netball, they're interested in
a particular
that particular
yes.
school or that particular community. So if you wanted to get that audience, you needed to be able to give them the content whenever they needed. And so really that Pixelot technology fundamentally changed our business model. And by the end of 2020, we'd sort of found the technology, we'd done a lot of testing with it, we'd realized what we wanted to do. We decided we were going to launch our own app as opposed to being YouTube, and we did that with the Pixelot guys as well. And we launched it on the 28th of April 2001, thinking COVID was a thing of the past. And we were live for 8 days, and you might remember the Joburg wave. They used to call it, even in overseas, they called it the Joburg, variant of COVID.
Oh, yes.
Hit, and that sort of shut us down again. Almost till the end of the year. But to give you a sense of what happened in that time, because technology had moved and we'd figured out how to do this, by December, against a business plan of 360 matches in 2020 and 480 matches in 2021, we produced 900 matches in 2 weeks in December of 21.
That is crazy.
In 2022, we produced 28,000 matches, and last year, 2023, we did 46,000 matches from 42 different sports in this country. So it was really just technology that allowed to completely fundamentally change what we were doing. And the other side, which I think a lot of South Africans don't always give a lot of support to, and yes, I run SuperSport Schools for them, but I'm also not full-time employed, is I think there's an enormous lack of understanding for what multi-choice and SuperSport specifically put into sport in this country, that they realized the opportunity and said, okay, we're going to invest a serious amount of money in being able to bring school and youth sport to this audience. And why this audience is so important is the kids and the youth themselves love watching themselves, and they want to be able to do it. And we knew SuperSport that was something that we wanted to do, because it was SuperSport's way of making sure that the next generation are care about and engaged in sport, which is obviously in their own interest, but it's massively in the interest of sport in South Africa as well. Secondly, we found in the audience, we talk about it as the sport you care about most, that for mothers, fathers, grandparents, even the kids themselves, school and youth sport is the sport they fundamentally care about the most. So if the Springboks are playing but your daughter's playing in an under 11 netball game, you're going to go and watch your daughter. And if you can't be there, it's, and unfortunately by the nature of our lives, we can't always be there. And sometimes it's because I grew up, my children grew up, I had a son and a daughter. One was playing cricket, one was playing water polo, one was playing hockey here, one was playing hockey there. I couldn't be at everything. And I used to rely on WhatsApp groups and all sorts of stuff. And sometimes the most frustrating thing in the world, the mothers on the WhatsApp group forget to update the score, and you don't know what, you're sitting there waiting to see who's typing, to see what's happening next. The beauty is now, with the SuperSport Schools app, you can be watching the one on the app and the other, and when you get home to the one you haven't seen,
you can catch up.
So for so many people, it's what they care about most. And for the kids themselves, they like to watch their mates, but they also like to go back and watch themselves. That's why when we built the app, we made sure that it was free, because we wanted kids to be able to not have to have a subscription to watch themselves play. We built in the tools to tag, edit, and share, so that kids can go in, tag, edit, and create their own highlights and various things.
Oh, lovely.
Which is a massive, it's important for our business, because we want kids to do that. And right now we've got about 1 million subscribers on the SuperSport Schools app. 71% of them use that function, mostly to WhatsApp groups. And so it's to, send it to granny, you missed my goal, or I scored a try, or I made this big tackle, and then they obviously from there, they're putting it out onto TikTok and Instagram and various else. And so we sort of call that our echo chamber. And our echo chamber of SuperSport Schools has just grown into the millions and millions of views every week, where people are just putting out little highlights of big tackles, goals, funny things that happen,
Gifts,
which is exactly, so all of those things, whatever they are. But absolutely, they've been a wonderful journey. So really, that's been the journey. And I guess my role in it, you asked, I guess from the beginning, I've taken you a long way around, but is really to build a commercial model that can support that in terms of sponsors and advertisers and people like that you can bring onto the platform. Because at the end of the day, this is a massive operations, and literally it's now hundreds of millions a year to bring all this content to South Africans and to people around the world. I mean, about 7 or 8% of our audience comes from outside of South Africa today.
Very interesting.
On the school and youth sport, and it's people traveling. I've had fathers phone me, missing their son's first team rugby debut because they were on a flight from, and one father recently was on a Virgin Atlantic flight from London to New York, and he missed his son's first team debut, and he sat and watched the entire game on the SuperSport Schools app on his phone, and in absolute tears because he just couldn't believe that he had that opportunity to do that, So again, that's when you realize you're creating content that people deeply, deeply care about, and that's why we sort of talk about SuperSport Schools as the sport you care about most. And so that's sort of been the journey of it. It sounds like a long story, and it's all been sort of cut into 2-3 years, but it's been
literally it evolved so quickly.
Absolutely.
Where do you see it evolving within the next decade?
The next decade? I'm worried about the next 2 years. You think about
Okay, let's start with 2 years then.
Yeah, look, I think one thing that you do in the world that we work in is you're starting to work on we call it our technology stack. So, we have Pixelot and our 2-camera units and our own production vehicles that are going out all the time and producing. And obviously, we continue to work on that. And there's a lot of work being done on that space and that we want to do. We've now done 48 different sports, but our AI technology can only do about 17 or 18. So we'd like to increase that.
Yeah.
In terms of our app, we're always working on that from a user experience perspective and what can be done with it. And when you've accumulated, we now have over 110,000 hours of school sport. Now, to give you a sense, SuperSport produces about 800 hours, maybe 1,000 hours a year.
Oh, geez.
We've got 110,000 hours of school and youth sport and all this incredible talent and various stuff. So a lot of it for us will be about how do we get into more communities and more schools all the time? How do we, when we film extraordinary talent, how do we make sure that the right people see it? That
how do
those
you
kids
source
are
your
found.
schools?
Oh, it's a combination of things. They find us, so we've got on a combination of routes. We've at the outset, the first schools that we engaged with were schools who had sport on a weekly basis because we needed the content, and from there we've grown it out into communities all over the country and various things. Obviously, there's the sort of quintile 1 to 3 schools are difficult because largely they don't have organized sport in their schools. We largely there rely on people who organize festivals and events like that, and so we've just had the most extraordinary people, and some of them that we came across, they got in touch with us and various things. So, to give you a sense, Lincoln Marley, for those who know the banking world, he was a senior banker at Standard Bank and various stuff, is the most extraordinary. He started a rugby festival in the Eastern Cape named after his father, Mzondile Marley, and they've run a wonderful program for the last couple of years. So we go and get that rugby from them. Off the back of that, he's just picked a team of kids, most of whom have never left their rural areas to play in a tournament. He's taking them all to London now in October, and we're going to film those games as well.
Amazing.
So he's a bit unique. Funny enough, the new Minister of Telecommunications, Solly Mabata, has run a tournament in Polokwane for the last 2-3 years that he got us involved. We didn't even, next thing I saw, he was the new minister.
New minister.
Like, sure. We know him as a
sports person.
Well, not as a sports person. It's just something that he'd always done, and he, through his foundation, he had some football tournaments and that we used to stream for him. So for us, it was sort of solely from Polokwane that we did this one. So there's people like him and Lincoln, and I'm using two pretty high-profile people, but there's a lot of
different collaborations,
just people just collaborating and people talking to us and finding content for us. And
lovely.
So it's it's a combination of those things, and then the other things is with the national federations. So, and a good example, obviously, from a STADIO perspective, is like Craven Week. We work with SA Rugby. We don't only stream and broadcast Craven Week, but we do all their the girls under 16, the girls under 19 Craven Week, under 13 Craven Week, under 16 Grand Coma Week, Academy Week, the Elson Week, and those sort of things as well. So all of SA Rugby's, but then we do, I think we're currently about 32 federations. We do all their national weeks.
That's amazing.
So that's gymnastics and wrestling. We did the national sheep shearing finals. Did you know that kids do sheep shearing competitively?
I was about to ask.
There you go. So we're the current world champions of sheep shearing in South Africa, but we did the school nationals. Yeah.
That's wild.
We did the school nationals, and the most interesting thing we found is kids under 12 don't get a sheep, they get a teddy bear to share. So at 12, I think it's 12, and 13 you get your own sheep, but until that you share teddy bears, for example. So we've done even that,
that is very interesting.
Which has been fun and interesting and just amazing to see, all these kids and parents and communities that live around these sports. And, for them, it's the most important thing, For the parents and kids who go to Craven Week, it's amazing. But for the kids who are going to, they have about 2,500 little girls, mostly little girls, sort of 9 to 17, 18 that come to the gymnastics nationals. I mean, that's crazy. If you've never been to anything, you've got to get to the gymnastics nationals in Pretoria every year. You'll be blown away by the talent, the enthusiasm, the passion. It's just extraordinary. That's, you know, that's going on there.
Okay, great. Let's talk about the role of technology since we were there. How is technology integrated into the operations of SuperSport Schools?
Look, technology is the thing that's allowed us to create SuperSport Schools. If we go back 5-6 years in the world, 6-7 years, of sort of traditional production, it would have been impossible for us to build what we built at scale. As I said to you, the original business plan was built around what we call mini production units, MPUs and various things like that, which is sort of 4 and 5 camera production units. And the business plan there was to do 360 or 480 matches a year. And that's sort of where we would have, we might have grown to 600 or 800 matches, but that would have been, it probably wouldn't have worked as a business, standalone. But technology really, on your team, absolutely,
because you obviously have to try to be everywhere at once.
Well, and you couldn't have been, and because